Welcome everyone to this NDIS webinar for families and caregivers. And my name is Mary Sayers and I'm the CEO of Children and Young People with Disability Australia. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land in which we're meeting today. I'm meeting on Wurundjeri land of the Kulin Nation, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present, emerging, and also to any Aboriginal people we have on the line today. And would also like to acknowledge that this was and always will be Aboriginal land. So as I mentioned before, my name is Mary Sayers. My pronouns are she, her, and I am the CEO of Children and Young People with Disability Australia. We're the representative organisation for children and young people in Australia. We have that enormous privilege. So today from CIDA, we have Miranda, who will also be co-presenting with me, and Sue, who will be troubleshooting and also monitoring the chat function. And so if you're having any technical problems, just put it in the chat. You can also ask questions in the Q&A function on the webinar. So just as a bit of context, we also have live captioning. So in order to access the live captioning, you can just click on the CC button. And we also have our Auslan interpreters, Paul and Glenda, joining us today. So thank you to you. The NDIS has put out some consultation papers about some very huge changes that are going to happen to the NDIS. And we think it's probably the biggest changes that have happened since the inception of the NDIS. So we really wanted to make sure that our members understood the changes, but also have an opportunity to input. You may know that we have a survey where we want to hear from our members about their NDIS experience, and Sue will paste the link to the survey. So if you'd like to provide feedback to our survey about your experience, then that actually helps us to inform our advocacy to government. So Sue, we have two surveys, one for young people and one for families and caregivers. So Sue has posted that, I can see in the link. So just in terms of the purpose of the sessions, the NDIA has put out 3 consultation papers, and Miranda's going to put up the PowerPoint presentation for me. If you need to see Paul, our captioner, you can pin Paul as well, or if you put it in gallery view, you should be able to see Paul. So in terms of next slide, Miranda. The 3 major changes that are being proposed are to the access and eligibility process. So we will talk about that for around 15 minutes. Changes to the NDIS planning process, and again, we'll talk about that for about 10 minutes, and changes to the early childhood, early intervention approach, which is around 10 minutes. But then we have time for Q&A. Because we had a lot of people who registered to attend today, we are doing this in a webinar format as opposed to a normal Zoom format. So you won't be able to ask your questions live, but you will be able to put them in the chat or in the Q&A function. And we'll try to get through as many questions as we can. And as you're going through and we're talking about the different changes, you don't need to wait until the Q&A at the end. You can ask your questions as we go. And so just as a bit of background, some of the changes proposed by the NDIS do not seem to be up for consultation, like the fact that there will be independent assessments, and many of the papers around how they will be implemented. However, that doesn't limit CIDA from advocating back to government to ensure that if these changes are made, or if indeed these changes occur at all, that we can advocate on behalf of our members. That's why we're so keen on your feedback. As we go through the papers, please feel free, as I mentioned before, to answer any questions. So I'm now going to hand over to Miranda, Cross, who's our policy advisor, who's doing our work to go through the first changes, which are changes to the access and eligibility process.
Okay, thanks, Mary. Yes, so I'll be going through 2 papers, and I guess I'll start off by saying we went through and highlighted some of the key information and information that we think like our community would really like to know, but we've also kind of highlighted areas where there's still a lot of unknown from our side as well. So I'll flag this with you too, where there's areas that yeah, the papers are a little bit vague. So I'll start with the access and eligibility paper, and if you haven't seen this paper before, I've taken this diagram from that paper. So these papers were put out by the NDIA. So anytime you hear me reference the NDIA, that refers to the National Disability Insurance Agency. So they are the governing body for the National Disability Insurance Scheme. So like the government department. So yes, they put out this, this diagram to show the proposed changes to the access and eligibility processes. So as you can see that step 1 and step 2, which I'll talk through in a minute, they're relatively similar to what already happens during the access process, but the step 3 and 4, which is in the box, that's very new and has changed the process quite dramatically. So a lot of you have heard about independent assessments. It's been on your radar, so we'll talk about those in more detail too. So I'll start by talking about the initial steps 1 and 2 and what that will look like. So these initial steps, this looks very similar to the current processes that I think many of you would have already experienced. So this is the processes where you submit an access form and provide evidence of disability and eligibility. So this entails, I guess one thing that is relatively new is the access forms are now online, so you won't need to go and access that form. So that's a little bit more accessible. But you still, yeah, similar to the previous process, you'll need to provide information and demonstrate your age requirements, that you meet residency requirements, so as in being an Australian resident, and that the disability, the impairment is likely to be permanent. So I guess the kinds of information that they're looking for is evidence and advice from treating health professionals. Yeah, so it's quite similar to the existing processes. What is different though is the access lists will no longer be used in the proposed changes. So everyone will be going through the same access processes. There is one exception, and that's in Western Australia, where they're still transitioning to the scheme. List C, which is the transitions from the state-based programs, that will still be used in WA, but yes, other than that, that is quite a major change. The access lists won't be used and everyone will be going through the same process. So this is the initial access steps. So just for instance, once you meet these access steps, what is really different is you won't necessarily get access to the NDIS, but if you meet these access steps, you will get a referral to an independent assessment. So that's where we're going to move next. So an independent assessment, what are they? So an independent assessment is an assessment of functional capacity, including environmental and individual circumstances. So individual assessments focus on capability rather than disability. So really the assessment is disability neutral because it's looking at the individual within their environment rather than specifically the disability. So as you can see on the slide, functional capacity refers to how a person's disability impacts their ability to carry out everyday tasks with and without assistance, and whether with assistance, whether with assistance tech or personal support. So again, it's like, I guess a more holistic a view of the person in their environment. So two people with the same diagnosis can still have very different functional capacity. So that's what they are. So how will they work? So as I mentioned, at this point, you've already met the initial access steps by submitting your access form and that initial evidence. And then this is where the independent assessments come in. So if you meet access in those initial steps, you'll be referred to an independent assessor in your local area. and then they will conduct an independent assessment with you that looks a little bit like that first dot point. So there'll be 4 parts. So it includes, and I've taken this from the NDIA website, a conversation, an activity, a questionnaire and the use of 3 to 4 standardized assessment tools. So it is public, the standardized assessment tools that the independent assessor will be using. They're on they're in the papers actually, if you're interested, but dependent on the age of the person is what tools they'll use. A little bit more about the tools too is they're all self-reporting tools. So in the sense that someone will be coming in and asking some questions and you'll answer them. There is one exception though, and that's called the Vineland tool. And that is where, so for instance, if you're undergoing an assessment for yourself, the Vineland tool, the assessor will be asking somebody else in your life that knows you questions about yourself. So that could be your partner or it could be a doctor. But yeah, so that's what it looks like a little bit. Some other things you should know is who will be conducting these individual assessments. So the plan is that local allied health professionals will be recruited, they'll be contracted by the NDIA rather, to perform these assessments. So I guess there's one thing to highlight there too is if they are contracted to do these assessments, they won't be able to offer NDIS funded services. So for instance, in your local area, if an OT or occupational therapist is doing the assessment, you won't be able to then hire that OT for a service later on. So it is something to be mindful of. What else will it look like? I guess the assessments, it's a little bit different to what happens at the moment for some areas in Australia, is that the setting will be in you'll choose the setting where you wish the assessment to take place. So it can be in your home setting or it could be in another setting that's familiar to you. That's really up to you. I'm not too sure what that looks like at the moment with, I guess, COVID restrictions if they're planning to do them online, but yet there is some flexibility about where the assessments will take place. We also know that the assessments are expected to take about 3 hours. So it does vary, but that's the estimate that the NDIA have put forward, that it takes about 3 hours. I will say too, there are some other flexible options that are available in these independent assessments. So if the individual chooses, they can do them over multiple sessions. They can bring along like a family member or a health professional or someone they feel comfortable with to the meeting as well. And also that, how much of the assessment that, so for instance, if you're undergoing the assessment, but you think you'd feel more comfortable if a partner or a carer or someone would do a portion of the assessment, that's okay too. That can be determined about how much of the assessment the individual does versus, say, a parent or a carer or a friend or whoever. So that's how they'll work. That's kind of what we know about that. Okay, so what happens next? So you've met access or initial access steps because you've provided the access form and you've met, I guess, what's required in displaying that your disability is permanent. And then you've done that independent assessment, so someone's come into your home or wherever, and they've done that assessment to I guess gauge your functionality. So how will these results be used? So these results will actually determine if a person has met access or not to the NDIS. So I guess the access component's two-pronged now. Those initial access steps where you do the form and provide the evidence, but also this assessment of functionality. So according to the documents that the NDIA release, that a person needs to demonstrate through this assessment that there's a substantial impact on their functional capacity in one or more areas of activity domains. So these 6 areas are, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yep, communication, social interaction, learning, mobility, self-care, and self-management. So I guess that's the second stage of this access process. What happens with the information? So you'll do the assessments, and then the results will be produced from the independent assessment, and then that will get sent to the NDIA. So ultimately, the decision lies with the NDIA delegate who gets the information about, the outcome, I guess, the results of the independent assessment. So it's up to the NDIA still to review the outcomes and say yay or nay. And then regardless if you meet access or not, the independent assessment results will be shared with you. Oh, sorry, I will add too. So as well as the step where the independent assessment information gets sent to the NDIA may also request some more information. So in some circumstances, the NDIA may request the individual to provide more information and evidence from their treating professionals, such as a history of supports that have been used in the past and not worked. So this additional information will also inform access decision. So I guess, yes, the key takeaways from access is there's three elements. The initial element when with the access form and providing initial evidence, the independent assessment, and then the potential that the NDIA may request some more information as well.
Thank you, Miranda. I've just noticed there have been a couple of questions which I think is probably worth answering as we go while we're still on independent assessment. So one was, do you still need to provide evidence of disability in addition to the IA? And then another question was, how are those independent assessments conducted for those who can't really communicate? Example, lower functioning, intellectual disability, and adults. So if you could have a stab at those two questions, Miranda.
Yes. The initial question, yes, you will need to provide evidence of disability. So it's really an added step. It's not replacing the old processes, but rather an additional step. The second question, sorry, about how will the assessments be conducted for a wider range of group. I do have, so the delegates have, the NDIA did list groups of people where the IAs will be exempt. So there's two groups. One, when there's risk and safety. So when the process is likely to do more harm than benefit the individual and may pose as a safety risk to the individual or the assessor. So the examples I've given is when paranoia is present or severe, or if there's specific trauma-related concerns which can't be alleviated. The second group that will be, I mentioned, is when the assessment, and I think this is probably more relevant to your question, is the assessment is inaccessible and invalid. So there may be concerns about processing valid information, and other sources of forms of information will be better suited. So I think that would, I guess, be more relevant to the question that you were asking. But I will say, other than that, I've seen this question asked by a few people, like how will exemptions work? And I guess we've been referred to these two dot points. So yeah, I would be curious to know if there's more in-depth information as well. But that's kind of what we know. And Mary, I think you're going to add.
Thank you, Miranda. And look, and I think this is one of the really tricky situations is if an independent assessment is actually going to realistically get a picture of the child or young person, which we're really concerned about, that if it is introduced, that there is a really accurate picture. So again, I would encourage you, if you could complete our survey, Sue will post the link again into the chat. That will really help us to provide feedback on the concerns people have. So whilst these are discussion papers, we can actually provide your feedback in de-identified forms around some of the challenges and problems with independent assessments. So I'll stop there and keep your questions coming through. They're fantastic. Thank you. And I'll hand back to Miranda.
Thanks, Mary. So now that we've got a bit of a picture of what the assessments intend to do and what they will look like, and then how the outcomes of the assessment will be used, I will add, sorry, it's that last bullet point, and I'll go into this in much more depth later. But not only will the independent assessments be used to gauge if a person meets access to the scheme, but the same results will be used to shape your draft plan budget. So again, quite different, and I'll make sure I go into depth in that in a minute. I guess this kind of leads to some of the questions that are coming in, as well as what if you don't agree with the access outcomes? So this is a little bit tricky because the results from the independent assessment go to the NDIA, who ultimately make the decision. The decision that the NDIA makes, or the delegate or the agency, whichever you prefer to refer to them, that decision they make can be appealed. So that's similar to the current processes where you can call for an internal review. And then if you're not happy with the outcomes of the internal review, you can then appeal that decision in the Administrative Appeals Tribunal. What I will make clear though, and I think this is where it gets a little bit messy, is you cannot appeal the results of the independent assessment. So to be clear, you can appeal how the NDIA interpret the results, but you cannot appeal the results. I hope that's clear, and I'll reiterate that point throughout. And that question comes up again about appeals, when someone asks in the audience about who will be exempt from the independent assessments, or who the independent assessments might not be relevant for or meet their needs. There is a note too, which I marked, and I think it's worth adding, that so those are the 2 points I mentioned before about where a person may be exempt, and it's up to the NDIA's discretion to decide if a person is exempt or not. And if they decide that a person is not exempt from the independent assessments, then there will not be, there's no opportunity to review that decision. So they've marked that as not a reviewable decision. So yes, I thought that was worth adding too. Okay, so that's independent assessments, and I know that's a lot to take in, and I will try to reiterate some of that information as we move on to the planning paper. Unless there were any other questions coming through, Mary. Yep, Mary.
There's another question, and we're throwing some icky, sticky questions at Miranda today. And just to reiterate that we're going based on the best information that's provided in the papers to us. But one question was, can participants request another IA if they disagree with the results?
That's a good question, actually, and they quite clearly say in the papers that you can't request an additional IA, and they do have some wording in the papers I don't have in front of me, but their argument was, or the NDIA's argument was, like, independent assessments are objective and it's the same measure used for everyone. So if we started appealing independent assessments, then it wouldn't be a fair and I guess all-encompassing procedure. So that's, I guess, sorry, a really long-winded way to say, no, you can't ask for it a new independent assessment. They quite clearly say that in the papers. Were there any other questions coming through? Sorry, I can't see the chat. All good? Okay. So keeping all that information in your mind about independent assessments, I'll go on to talk about the second paper, which is the planning paper, which I think, so as Mary said, there's 3 papers the NDI have put out. One that goes through the changes in access and eligibility, and that includes the independent assessment. The second one, the planning paper, and I think this one has potentially been overlooked a little bit because we're all, I guess, all our focus is on the independent assessments, but there's quite a lot of change proposed in this paper too. So I'll run you through the changes and let you know how independent assessments impacts planning as well, but also some of the other changes proposed. So again, this diagram I took from the planning paper, and by the way, all this stock information is public online on the NDIA website. So if this isn't quick enough, if it's on the slide too quickly for you to get a proper look, it's all online in those papers that we mentioned. But So I guess what I've highlighted with the red arrow, the orange arrow, step 4, that's when the individual comes in. So step 1, 2, and 3 happens, I guess, before you have your planning meeting. And I'll talk you through this. So it's changed quite a lot. And as you can see, as I mentioned before, step 1, this assumes that the individual's undergone an independent assessment and it produced outcomes and determined your functional capacity or your child's functional capacity. So here, in terms of planning, after you complete, so step 1, sorry, after you complete the independent assessment, the results then go straight to the NDIS delegate. And from the outcomes of the independent assessment, then a draft budget is formed. So I guess I'll just repeat that because it's quite different. A draft budget is formed before you get to the planning meeting. The planning meeting no longer determines what will be in the budget. So I'm just going to skip ahead to show you some slides and talk this through a little bit more. So as I said, yes, the planning meetings will no longer determine the amount of your budget. Instead, the results from the independent assessment will largely shape the planned budget. So what this will look like, a person will undergo an independent assessment. So either in that initial access process, or if you're getting a new plan, you'll need to undergo the independent assessment again. And then the results will be sent to an NDIA delegate and a draft budget. What we're very curious about, and there was actually a really interesting article that was released this morning by the DSC, which is a website that releases really good resources around the NDIS, is we're not quite clear how the functional assessment will then turn into a budget. We know from the papers that will happen, but we're not really quite sure the mechanisms or how it's calculated or whatever. It's been a bit of an opaque process there. So I will flag that that's what happens, but we don't really know the nitty-gritty of how it will happen. But ultimately, it will happen, well, in the proposed changes, it will happen, and then the budget that you will get will reflect the expected costs of providing a reasonable and necessary package of supports for a participant. And this wording, I think, which I've highlighted, reasonable and necessary package. So this is quite different again, because it's looked at you and it's looked at you as a whole, and it's determined this is your functional capacity. This is roughly the amount that you will need. So 2 people with the similar functional capacity, regardless of the disability they have, will, environmental context, will have a similar package. So I guess it's very different in the sense that you'll be getting a sum of money that's a reasonable and necessary package, rather than a package that consists of lots of little reasonable and necessary supports. So sorry, I know that's lots of use of reasonable and necessary, but it is quite a big change. You'll be getting one big package that's all encompassing, rather than a package that includes lots of reasonable and necessary supports. So I think when I go through the planning a bit more, hopefully this makes a bit more sense. So that's how it will be formed. So knowing that, and that you're going into a planning meeting already with a draft budget, what will the planning meeting look like? Oh, sorry, I will add to this, how the planning budget is formed. So this is quite different as well. So previously, anyone who's had an NDIS plan before, or your child or the child you care for has had a plan before, the funds are allocated into those 3 categories: the core, the capacity building, and the capital supports. So these supports will be a thing of the past. They've just changed them now to fixed funds and flexible funds. So I'll go through the definitions that they gave. So the fixed funds will be predetermined by the NDIA. So they'll look at your assessment, and they might potentially ask for more support, for more evidence as well. So they'll look at that, and then they'll have fixed allocations for certain supports. So this means that you won't be able to spend those funds on anything other than on those supports. So it could be for assistive technology or employment supports or things like that. So that's the fixed funds, and then the other portion will be your flexible funds. So the individual will have a lot more flexibility about how they can spend these funds. So the definition they've said is that flexible funds can be used more freely for disability-related supports of your choosing. Flexible funds can also be used to top up your fixed funds. So for instance, if you have X amount of money for employment supports in fixed funds, but it's running low, you can use your flexible funds to then top that up. I will flag to what we're not too sure so that's your personal budget, and it has those two main types of supports, funds, but we're not really sure what it looks like in reality. Like, will the fixed funds be 80% of the budget, and then the person's left with the flexible, like 20% flexible funds, or if it's 50-50, or if it really varies between the individual. That's something that's a little bit unclear from the papers, and that we're wanting to find out more about as well. So yes, and then when they allocate that budget, it will be in 12 months. So yeah, that's, I guess, how the budget is formed. So I know, well, historically, the current process is that you will form your budget in the planning meeting. So now that we've established that the planning meeting doesn't do that, I'll run through what a planning meeting will look like. So a few things are the same in a planning meeting with your, actually one thing I will add as well. As the draft budget will already be formed before the planning meeting, you will get to see it before the meeting as well. So in the papers, they say that they'll send you the paper, the draft budget, and you'll have some time to go over it, either by yourself or with someone in your life that you like to share that information with. So before going into the planning meeting, you will have some time to prepare and know what your budget entails and how much of it's fixed and how much of it's flexible. Sorry. Okay, so what does the planning meeting look like? Sorry, 1 second.
While Miranda's having a little pause, I just wanted to check, would this be a time when the Auslan interpreters need to cross over, or you'll manage that yourself? Okay, you're right to keep going. There was a question in the chat about how often do you need to get an independent assessment, given that a child with autism has a long-standing condition that's not going to change. So will we need a new assessment for each plan? And what the discussion paper says is that the maximum time between independent assessments is 5 years, and the minimum will be 3 months. And the agency would ask for an updated independent assessment after a check-in if the circumstances had changed radically or a change in the functional assessment has occurred, consideration of a participant's request to review the plan where a significant change in circumstances, or a date or circumstance described in the participant plan. So it does sound from the discussion paper that it's not necessarily a regular process. It can be up to 5 years, but there are from time to time when an independent assessment could be requested. So I hope that answers that question. And Miranda, if you've got anything else to add, please feel free to add to that question.
Yeah, I think, and again, this is something that's been raised that's a bit ambiguous as well. And the indication of the 5 years is because plans, and I'll go into this in more depth, but plans can now be up to 5 years long. But if you are redoing your plan, so say you've decided after 3 years you'd like to redo your plan, it kind of indicates that you will need to do a new independent assessment after that 3 years if you need an entirely new plan. And they also marked other areas like life transitions, so transitioning to high school and things like that, where you'll need to undergo another independent assessment. There are also options for, I think it exists already, like a light touch review. Whereas if you're just wanting to make small changes to your plan, you won't need to undergo an independent assessment. But yeah, from how they've worded it, if you are redoing a plan, so you were doing a plan review in the current model, you will need to undergo an independent assessment. So I'll I'll keep going because I think I'll come back to that, and hopefully it makes a bit more sense when I talk about the other changes in the plan. So sorry, yes, the planning process. So some things will be similar to what you might be familiar with in the current processes. So there'll be questions that you'll talk to your LA or your local area coordinator about, like whether you like to self-manage the plan or be agency managed, things like that. And also the local area coordinator or the planner you're working with should also be connecting you with general supports in the community that'll help you implement your plan. So that's looks the same. What is pretty different is goals. So in the current processes, goals are intended to inform the supports you need, the reasonable and necessary supports you need. Whereas in the current model, goals will be used to guide how you'll spend your budget. So rather than shape your budget, they'll guide how you spend your budget. So it is actually quite ambiguous about what that will look like in reality, if you're expected to have goals to spend your budget, or if it's more just to help the person, like as in a guide, or if it's something that a person is expected to do. But goals is really quite different. And this is one of the questions we've included in the surveys, because they've really reshaped the planning processes. Like goals are no longer the forefront, but something that, you know, is just comes a little bit later. And we're really interested to hear from family and caregivers and young people doing the survey as well on behalf of themselves. What does this mean to you? Is this a good thing that goals aren't necessarily at the forefront anymore? Will that make the process easier? Or is it a bad thing to see that goals have been, I guess, a little bit secondary in this new planning approach? I'll speed it up a bit. Sorry, Mary, I'm eating into your time. Some of the other additions in the planning meeting, and I made reference to this before, so this is new, that you will now be able to determine the length of your plan. So you'll discuss this with your local area coordinator. If you want to plan, it can be, for instance, you might be a plan that you might be quite happy with, and you can decide to have it for 3 years or 4 years or whatever, up until 5 years. Or you might decide that 1 year is enough planning, so you can decide that too. But I guess it does bring in that question, well, if I'm going to do a plan every 2 years, does that mean I'll need to do an independent assessment every 2 years? And from what we can gauge from the papers, if it is an entirely new plan, yes, you will have to do an independent assessment each time you get a new plan. Some of the other things that will change in the planning meeting is the release of funds. So for instance, you decide to get a 4-year plan, you won't get 4 years worth of funding. It would be too big of a burden for anyone. So you'll discuss with your local area coordinator how long you want those funds to be released. So the examples they've given is quarterly or monthly. So I think the intention is to help people budget. And the last thing that will be discussed in planning meetings that is new is the frequency of check-ins. So check-ins should already be happening in the current processes, whereas when the local area coordinator or the agency planner, whoever you're working with, checks in to make sure everything's okay, if you're able to implement your funds and things like that. So now they're letting people decide how often they want those check-ins to be. There are a few exceptions where an local area coordinator or a planner will intervene earlier than these proposed check-ins, and I guess that's when they realise that the person isn't spending their money, or there's an unusual spending, or if they've marked the person as someone who might need some extra supports. So I'll keep going. And this is similar to the access decisions that we were talking about earlier. What does the person have the power to appeal, and what do they not? So again, this is a little bit complicated, but similar to the access processes, a person can appeal the decisions that the NDIA make. So ultimately, your draft budget will be formed from the independent assessment. The NDIA delegate will look at it and like ultimately say yes or no, or I need more evidence before I give the person their support and things like that. So they're the kinds of decisions you can appeal, but you cannot appeal an independent assessment. So, and similar to that question that was asked before, you won't be able to request a new independent assessment either. They did mention, because I was on the lookout for this as well, that there is a complaints process that is being set up. Sorry, where's the wording? So in the papers, it's mentioned that there's a complaints process that will be available for applicants who are dissatisfied with the independent assessment, the assessor or the assessor organisation. But that's really all we know. That's as much as it entails. So you can complain, but they've made it quite clear that you won't be able to appeal those results. So that's the planning paper, Mary. I might let you run through the ECEI paper if that's okay.
Thank you, Miranda. And we are aware that there is a lot of information in these papers, and we have been trolling through them for the last month, really looking at them. And so we understand that there's a lot of information. And just to reiterate, we will be able to share the slides and there will be a recording of this video as well. So please, you know, don't stay with us. I know there's a lot of information to digest. And thank you for the questions that people have been posting. Just to also let you know that if you're making comments or questions, we're also recording those so that we can use that information in a de-identified way to actually inform our response to the discussion paper. And the types of questions that you're all asking are the types of questions we've been asking too, and there's many unanswered things in the papers. So now moving on to the changes for the early childhood, early intervention approach. And to summarise the changes, they're calling it an ECEI reset. So the NDIA is looking to fully support evidence-based best practice, to focus on the support and support the role and influence of parents and caregivers, and support children to participate meaningfully in all aspects of their life. And so this is, in our view, obviously anything that's best practice, we're really keen on. And we really have been advocating for many years that for young children, families are their caregivers and the supporter of them upholding their rights. So we're pleased to see a focus on the role and influence of parents and caregivers. The goal around supporting children to participate meaningfully in all aspects of their lives really talks to making sure that children, particularly children in those preschool years, attend early childhood education and care, attend things like playgroups in their community, so that children are supported to participate in all aspects of their lives that will lead to good outcomes. Next slide, Miranda. So other changes that are proposed to the early childhood, early intervention approach is increasing the age up to 9 years. And they're also asking feedback from advocacy organisations and for people responding. Would this be a beneficial thing? And in our view, we're coming to the mind that it might be a beneficial thing because it covers those really important transitions from early childhood through to school, which we know are often very difficult years, and supporting the inclusion of children through that period. There's also a focus on increased supports for children earlier and without the need for diagnosis. And I'll talk about that a little bit where the paper talks about short-term early intervention. And increased prioritisation of providing supports in natural settings. So what that means is natural settings is kind of shorthand for in the community. So as I said, it might be playgroups, it might be in early childhood education, in those supports in the child's home where the child is working in their environment and living the majority of time. So that's what the agency mean when they're talking about natural settings. So moving on, There is a focus, and this is new terminology, is just back one, in short-term early interventions. And so short-term early interventions is a new language for something that's probably already happened but not really transparent in early childhood. It's a program of supports that are designed to build the family's capacity to support their child to develop skills that will help them take part in daily activities. It might look like groups, individual or parenting programs, or capacity building therapies. And it is proposed that many children will no longer need the NDIS after the short-term early intervention supports are delivered earlier in life. And for the short-term early interventions, that's where a diagnosis might not necessarily be needed, but there is some form of developmental delay. So these short-term early interventions would be provided by early childhood partners in the community. And so the idea is that those interventions can be provided to help the child in their development and to participate in their community and to support the family, to support the child. So moving on to what's the role of independent assessments for children aged under 9. I'll get Miranda to change the slide. So the NDIA have said that independent assessments will not be used for children under the age of 1, and that there's proposed to be a tailored approach to the independent assessments for children up to 9 years of age, using child-specific standardised assessment tools. It's also proposed that the NDIS early childhood partners in the community will administer these assessments rather than someone else who is a stranger to the child. So they are still, and this isn't a point where they actually haven't been 100% clear, and they're looking for feedback on independent assessments, and the discussion paper asks around independent assessments for children aged under the age of 7. So moving on, that's where we come to our open question and answer time, and I know we actually have answered quite a number of questions as we've been going through, and there's a few questions which Miranda and I will attempt to answer, and Sue again has also put some information. So one of the participants has said there are 2 submissions where families can send their concerns: the NDIA submission by the 21st of February and a parliamentary submission by late March. And that is correct. There are submissions at the NDIA, but the Senate has actually formed a committee that's looking at independent assessments. And you can probably stop sharing the screen now, Miranda. Thank you. In terms of other questions, I'll call on Sue if there's any other questions that we haven't answered.
I think one of the questions that has been coming up is, are there going to be changes to support, plan support? So, sorry, I'm just trying to find, and changes to self-management. So support coordinators, sorry, I was having trouble remembering the words. Any change to support coordinators or self-managers as part of this process?
I'll perhaps talk around the self-manager one and then hand over to Miranda. For children aged under 7 currently, and if they go up to change 9, one of the questions in the discussion paper is around registered providers, and that those children who are receiving individual funding would need to go to registered providers. So in a way, that may change the types of services that self-managers for young children can choose, but it's still quite unclear. In terms of support coordination, Miranda, I'll hand over to you for that question.
Yeah, thanks, Mary. It's a question that's been coming up quite a lot in other, I guess, community groups or community consultations as well. And to be honest, there's just very little reference to support coordination in the policy papers. I'm not sure where they come in. And in that sense, there's I mean, the planning paper in general, there's very little comments about plan implementation. It's focused on, you know, how you'll get your budget and then like the nuances of how often you'll get the funding and things like that. But there's not a lot of mention about how a person will be supported to find services in their local area or implement their plans and things like that. So thank you, very good question, but I'm not quite too sure how to answer it, sorry.
And Sue, any other questions that are coming through?
A lot of the questions have been answered in the Q&A section themselves. And there's obviously some comments around the use of the word independent assessors. And I suppose just for us to clarify that CIDA is using the language in the consultation papers and in the guidance at this stage so that people can see what the agency is saying. So we're taking on board the feedback about independent assessments not being independent if they're paid for by the agency, but we're trying to use the language that's being used in the papers.
Yes, thank you, Sue. And I think it's fair to say that we probably agree with you, the words independent assessments being a little troubling when the agency is actually paying for them. And that's certainly something we'll be raising in our submission. There is also some feedback about concerns about the short consultation time for families, and we're also worried about that, and which was one of the reasons we actually decided that we should have an information session and know that there's a lot of information to digest, and we tried to pick out the really important high-level changes because they're so substantial. But that's certainly something that we can feed back to the agency, that families are reporting to us that there's still insufficient time for them to respond in time. And a comment was people need time to understand the changes, digest it, and then have the opportunity to provide well-informed feedback to the NDIA. So we will certainly be providing that feedback. So thank you very much for that comment.
One of the other questions that's come in is around when do these changes come in? So Miranda, whether we can talk through the time frame of the changes planned around independent assessments and then the other changes?
Sure. So the intention is that the rollout will be mid-year. And I saw a question that came up in the chat, which I think would be interesting to discuss, Mary, is about what checks have been in place and what data collection. So considering that mid-year is very, very close, Mary, if you want to touch on what we know about the pilots that are going on at the moment as well.
Yes, certainly. And, you know, in terms of having enough time to implement the independent assessments throughout, we understand for eligibility that there is not legislative change that's required for the NDIA to implement this. But we do know for the independent assessments to be included as part of planning as proposed, that does require legislative change. And so the legislative change is looking to come to the Parliament in a couple of months, we think over the next month. And of course, CIDA as an organisation will really be looking in depth into the legislative change. So we suspect that the changes for eligibility will come in first and then later on down the track. When we look at how many participants there are in the scheme, it's going to take a number of years before the changes could be fully implemented. But certainly it is something we'll continue to pursue to get timelines. We also know that they're undertaking pilots of the independent assessments process at the moment and that they're collecting data. So some of you may have already been contacted. So some of you may already be contacted and asked to do an independent assessment as part of the pilot. So I hope that answers the question. And there was a question about the check-in by the NDIS. Is a check-in is, and maybe you could answer that one, Miranda, is more of around the relationship the LAC or the NDIA early childhood partner actually has a conversation with people to check in and how they're going, I think is the intention. Is that correct, Miranda?
Yeah, check-ins, it really is just, the intention is to check in to make sure people are okay. It's not necessarily about collecting data or anything like that, but sometimes on the local area coordinator's side, they'll see that a person isn't using, like they might use data to recognize a person might need some extra support. So I guess if I made any mention to data, it's not about collecting data on a person, but just acknowledging that, oh, that person's not necessarily using their funds, something might be up. I'll check in with them to make sure they're okay. So it's, yeah, sorry if that was a bit confusing on my end.
One of the things, Mary, sorry, that it might be worth adding is that the agency are piloting the independent assessment part of the process, but the other parts that they're talking about, the changes, they are not piloting those, and that's why the consultation papers and providing this feedback is so important.
I'm just conscious we've just clicked over to 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, or Eastern Daylight Standard Time, and our Auslan interpreters are only booked, so we will have to wrap up. As next steps, obviously we're encouraging you to complete the survey, which we've posted a number of times, and thank you to everyone that has. We'll be sending out the slides from today, and if people need the recording as well, we're happy to. But finally, and I'm sorry we haven't been able to answer every single question. We've tried to do our best we can on the fly with your questions. So, but your questions are really insightful for us in terms of the gaps in information that are there in terms of the papers. So, would like to say thank you to our captioner and thank you to our Auslan interpreters. Thank you to Miranda and Sue for assisting with today, but also thank you to all of you who continue to help us to be a strong advocate for you and your family, and also encourage you, if you're not a member of CIDA, to actually join CIDA, because then we can always be in contact with you for future events and future activities. And a reminder, if you have a young person who is an NDIS participant, we also have an information session specifically targeted at young people, which is happening Thursday evening at 7 p.m. And I did post the registration in the chat. So thank you, everyone, and look forward to continuing to work with you, and thank you again.